I want you to pause for a moment and truly internalize this headline we're looking at. America's medicine runs out.
It's a shocking phrase, isn't it?
It sounds utterly catastrophic, like something ripped straight from a dystopian disaster movie.
Right. Not something you'd expect from the wealthiest, most, technologically advanced nation in the world.
And yet this near miss, this crisis that erupted,
Mhm.
is precisely what we are diving into today.
It really is the ultimate reality check. We've all seen the media narrative, right?
Mhm.
It's all focused on tariffs, trade retaliation, and this kind of diplomatic tough talk.
Between Washington and Ottawa.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
That's the noise. But if you cut through it, you realize this wasn't just some simple spat over trade. This whole crisis is a slow-motion exposure of a deep systemic fragility.
A fragility in what sense?
In how commercialized the American healthcare system has become and how deeply it depends on foreign forces it just arrogantly assumed it could always control.
Okay, let's unpack this entire situation then. We've pulled together a whole stack of sources that really dissect the structural choices made over, the last 20 years.
It's lease.
Choices that led the U.S. to rely almost entirely on its closest neighbor, Canada, for essential medicines. So our mission in this deep dive is to understand not just what happened, but why the U.S. was so exposed.
And what happens when that neighbor, Canada, just makes a rational decision to prioritize its own people first?
So let's start with the trigger event. It begins with Washington. Washington, feeling powerful, escalates a trade war, imposing new barriers, new tariffs on a whole bunch of Canadian goods.
And the assumption, as it so often is, was that U.S. economic power is just so overwhelming.
That Canada would just, absorb the
To
damage?
absorb the damage and conform to U.S. demands. Exactly.
And that assumption proved fatal. I mean, maybe not literally fatal for everyone, but certainly for the immediate well-being of thousands of Americans.
Oh, absolutely. Canada's response was strategic, it was decisive, and it went straight to the deepest American vulnerability.
Health.
Health. Ottawa invoked a national interest clause and designated pharmaceuticals as a national security asset. That move immediately triggered a regulatory tightening on the exports of essential medicines.
And we should be clear, when we say essential medicines, we're not talking about, highly specialized drugs for rare conditions.
No, not at all.
We're talking about the backbone of modern medicine. Generic drugs, crucial antibiotics, and most visibly, insulin supplies. So what does designating them as a national security asset actually mean in, legal terms for Canada?
It basically gives the government extraordinary power to intervene in the market. It means they can mandate that domestic needs are met before any surplus is sold internationally.
So it's a Canada-first policy for medicine.
Precisely. And our sources show this wasn't just symbolic. It was immediately backed up by legal constraints, inspections, things that prevented distributors from fulfilling their existing U.S. contracts. It was a rapid, hard economic counterstrike. It was essentially saying, you can hit our steel and lumber, but we will protect our sick citizens.
And the immediate fallout for the U.S. was, you called it catastrophic panic.
I was.
Because there was no domestic buffer at all. Hospitals started sending out these internal memos, warning of imminent shortages.
We saw pharmacists begin rationing supplies they already had on hand.
And patients all across the country, especially those with chronic conditions, just started scrambling, worried sick about their next refills, all while the scarcity drove prices for the available stock just through the roof.
That instant panic is what's so fascinating because it exposes the central contradiction here.
Go on.
For decades, the U.S. has been portrayed as this global model of strength, of self-reliance, of economic resilience.
Right.
Yet a single targeted policy response from a friendly northern neighbor, not a hostile power, sends the entire healthcare system into an emergency. It proves the system wasn't resilient at all. It was running on borrowed time, borrowed inventory, and frankly, borrowed political stability.
Okay, wait. You call Canada's move rational state behavior, and I get that from a structural standpoint, but doesn't calling it rational kind of ignore the fact that Canada also benefited hugely from that trade relationship for decades? They were filling gaps and making profits from U.S. dependency. So isn't this move still, economically putative? Doesn't the U.S. have a right to feel betrayed?
That's a fair point. It is punitive, absolutely.
Okay.
But it underscores a fundamental difference in state priority.
How so?
When the U.S. imposed tariffs, it was based on economic policy. It was about gaining a trade advantage. When Canada responded, it shifted the entire argument from trade advantage to human life.
So it's a moral calculation.
It's a moral and a functional calculation. It was a government deciding that life-saving medicine shouldn't be treated like surplus lumber or steel. The U.S. assumed its power would prevent this from ever becoming a real problem. Canada just formalized the principle that medicine exists to keep people alive, not just to smooth over trade deals.
Okay, that brings us to the core issue. If the trade war was just the trigger, how did the U.S. get so vulnerable in the first place? This level of dependency, it doesn't just happen overnight.
Absolutely not. To understand this, you have to look way past the tariffs and see the core design flaw in the U.S. healthcare model. This dependency wasn't some unfortunate accident. It was a long series of deliberate policy choices.
Choices that treated what? The whole supply chain.
The entire complex healthcare supply chain, from raw ingredients to bottling to distribution, as just a cost center to be optimized.
Optimize, a classic business term, meaning cut expenses wherever you can, regardless of the long-term risk. I remember one source highlighted the dangerous reliance on just-in-time logistics.
Yes.
Which sounds incredibly efficient on a spreadsheet, but what does it actually mean for national resilience?
It means exactly what just happened. The entire system was reshaped around one singular objective, maximizing shareholder value.
Profit.
Purely profit. When you prioritize profit above all else, redundancy just looks wasteful. Stockpiles look like idle capital. Domestic production looks expensive.
So you move it.
You move it. Manufacturing capacity, especially for active pharmaceutical ingredients, the core chemical components, moved overseas. Bottling, finishing, final assembly, a lot of that moved just across the border to Canada, chasing cheaper labor, lighter regulations, and fatter profit margins.
And what corporations called global competitiveness?
Our sources call systemic fragility.
And what's really crucial here is that this wasn't just about moving the entire supply chain to, say, Asia. A huge chunk of it went to Canada because it offered this unique blend of proximity, which makes logistics easier and faster, but it still offered lower overhead.
And different regulatory frameworks than operating in the U.S. It felt politically safe.
Protected by a friendly border, the political risk was just assumed to be zero.
And that was the critical oversight.
So how does this contrast with the Canadian approach?
They maintained a far different balance. They use public price negotiation. They keep tight regulations on what's considered essential. They consistently treat these medicines more like public infrastructure, like water treatment or emergency services.
Not like a luxury good.
Exactly. So when Ottawa called pharmaceuticals a national security asset, they were really just formalizing a philosophy that already existed, not inventing a new one.
This all raises a huge question for me.
Yeah.
Were policymakers just completely blind to this risk? Or was this an intentional disregard?
Oh, there was intentional disregard for the warnings. For years, experts testified before Congress about the serious risks of over-reliance on foreign supply chains, especially for generic drugs.
So they knew.
They knew. They pointed out that a disruption, a pandemic, a natural disaster, a trade dispute would hollow out U.S. reserves immediately.
But meaningful action was delayed, sidelined, blocked. Why?
Because rebuilding domestic API capacity costs billions upfront, and that directly reduces short-term profits. A profit-driven system is, it's biologically programmed to resist exactly that kind of necessary long-term public investment.
So when you hear officials now saying it'll take 2 or 3 years to replace the capacity that Canada restricted, that timeline isn't just a technical necessity. It's the political and economic cost of delayed choices finally coming due.
That's a perfect way to put it. You either invest before the crisis to build redundancy, or you pay exponentially more in price and in human suffering during it.
Okay, so if that's the systemic cause, the maximization of profit over public health, let's pivot to the direct human consequences we saw in the sources. I mean, what does this structural failure actually mean for you, for ordinary people?
It means the cost is immediately borne by the most vulnerable. It's not the executives who approve the outsourcing or the investors who benefited.
They're not the ones feeling the immediate pinch.
Not at all. We saw this real-world stress reflected in our sources, often in just heartbreaking detail.
Is there an example that really stuck out to you?
There was one specific quote from a pharmacist in North Carolina. He was forced to instruct the families of his elderly patients to cut their generic high blood pressure pills in half.
In half. Why?
Because the wholesale price had doubled overnight and they couldn't risk running out of their entire stock. That is what systemic fragility looks like on the ground. It's diabetics wondering if their next month's insulin will be affordable, or families deciding between the mortgage and medication.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, a crisis like this in a fragmented market system, It always reveals who was protected and who was just left completely exposed.
Absolutely.
Wealthy Americans, they're going to find the medicine. They'll pay more, use private concierge channels, maybe even fly overseas for refills.
Right. But the shortages concentrate all the pain and pressure on those who are already stretched thin, whose lives depend on stable access and predictable prices.
That's the class dimension quietly entering the picture.
It's always there. This exposure is compounded by the total failure of organization within the U.S. system.
What do you mean by failure of organization?
Instead of collective planning, the way we treat core public goods like fire protection or clean water, the U.S. healthcare system is built on fragmentation.
Right. You have hospitals competing fiercely against each other for limited suppliers.
And states competing for contracts, and ultimately patients competing through price. That fragmentation is just deadly in a moment of stress.
It turns what could have been a manageable national disruption into
A cascading, localized failure.
Exactly. And it really underscores the deep irony here. The U.S. spends more per person on healthcare than any other society in history.
Twice as much as some of its peers, yeah.
Yet it cannot guarantee basic access to life-saving medicine when a simple trade dispute erupts with its closest ally.
It proves the issue is never about a scarcity of resources.
No.
It's about how those resources are organized, who controls them, and what goal the system is fundamentally designed to serve.
And that goal was clearly profit, not guaranteed supply. So as this critical story continues to unfold, you have to notice how the media frames this whole thing. It's all diplomatic drama, personality clashes, who escalated the most.
Right, like it's just a beef between two leaders.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that framing is critical because it distracts us from the deeper issue, which is, why does access to life-saving medicine depend on volatile trade relations at all?
That is the question. And the most deafening thing about this whole debate isn't the political shouting, it's the silence.
The silence around what?
Around who is actually responsible. The problem is portrayed as entirely external. Canada did this, the trade war did this. Rarely is the question asked, why did the U.S. allow such a vital national function to be governed almost entirely by corporate incentives with, minimal public oversight?
And that silence is intentional.
It has to be. It protects the system and the financial interests that benefited from this fragility in the first place.
Let's analyze the so-called solutions that are being floated right now. Pharmaceutical companies are talking about streamlining regulatory approvals.
Right.
Investors are talking about emergency incentives to bring manufacturing back. Politicians talk about emergency funding, temporary waivers.
They're all presented as fixes, but if you look closely, they're just Band-Aids.
They address the flow, but they ignore the faucet.
Perfect analogy. They allow for surface reforms, temporary subsidies, short-term exceptions, but they meticulously preserve the core power relationships. They might fix the immediate shortage, but they do nothing to address the structural reliance on private profit as the sole engine for essential supply.
Okay, so what ideas remain conspicuously off the table? What are the structural solutions that are not being discussed?
The ideas that threaten the underlying profit logic. We're talking about restructuring ownership, decommodifying essential drugs, or building a publicly accountable domestic manufacturing base.
What does decommodifying a drug even mean?
Well, it doesn't have to mean full state ownership, but it could mean guaranteed public purchasing power. The government acts as a single, massive buyer and guarantees manufacturers a fair, stable profit margin.
And in exchange?
In exchange for guaranteed domestic capacity and stable pricing, you remove that volatile market incentive to constantly chase the lowest global costs.
So you'd be treating medication like the military treats ammunition.
Precisely. You ensure you have the domestic capability, even if a foreign source is currently cheaper.
But that level of intervention threatens the core economic ideology that created the crisis.
Exactly. The system allows for surface reforms that prevent an immediate collapse, but they ensure the crisis just slowly becomes normalized. Higher prices become accepted as the cost of doing business. Emergency measures become permanent fixtures.
Which guarantees that the next crisis, built on the exact same structural flaws, is inevitable. And that normalization is the quiet danger, isn't it? It's how systemic failure becomes accepted reality. The sources show a clear, repeating pattern here. The same logic that hollowed out American heavy manufacturing.
Hollowed out as pharmaceutical capacity. This is a design problem. It was a choice, not just unlucky timing.
This crisis really forces a necessary reckoning with some fundamental U.S. assumptions.
It has to.
The assumption that markets will always deliver necessary goods perfectly. The assumption that your allies will always just absorb your risks without retaliation.
And the big one, the assumption that overwhelming power makes you immune to dependency.
None of those assumptions survived contact with reality.
Not when Canada simply acted in its own rational national interest.
So as you continue to watch this story unfold, we encourage you to look closely at what is not being proposed by officials in their press conferences.
That boundary, the ideas that are deemed impossible or unrealistic, that tells you exactly where the real power lies in this debate.
And what interests the system is truly designed to protect.
The real question this whole moment presents is about values. When the medicine runs out, it's not because we lacked the knowledge or the resources to prevent it. It's because we chose a system built on a radically different standard, one where interruption is tolerable and scarcity is normalized if it maximizes returns. And that leads us to the ultimate question we have to confront. Do we believe medicine is a guaranteed human right, or is it just another highly profitable product?
So think about what you are willing to demand to force structural change. Because if we treat this simply as a diplomatic spat that can be solved with a new trade deal, we will just lurch into the next inevitable emergency, and ordinary people will pay the price again. Thank you for joining us for the deep dive.